Yes, we just moved them around. Yeah. I'm not sure who's there actually. Yes, I'm not sure who's there. Yeah.
Hello. Hello. Christiana, can you hear this?
Loud and clear.
Excellent.
Hi, Roland.
Thank you. We're all making this new experience of hybrid events. So some events are actually easier to follow when you are virtual. And it used to be exactly the other way around. We used to be in person, and then those listening in were second class, but it's almost inverted. So I will try to speak loud for those here and also for those virtual. So I'd like to welcome you all to our session on the business case for circular buildings. Make yourself comfortable as much as you can. We do have to, I think, stop it now in terms of letting people in. So if more people come, then they have to join virtually. I would like to recommend those here that if you're not speaking, keep your mask on, just because we have had cases here at the COP, and we really want to make sure everybody is safe. So only when we speak, we take off the mask. My name is Roland Honziger, and I'm the Director for Built Environment at the WBCSD. And I'd like to just frame briefly our conversation and then obviously hand to our speakers who will walk us through the things we want to cover today. We're talking about circularity. And the report we often quote is from the Energy Transition Commission and Material Economics that tells us that we can reduce about 40% of emissions in hard to abate sectors through circularity. They say in a market like Europe that is already built, that potential is actually much higher. It's over 50%. So circularity is a very important lever for us to unlock the transition towards a net zero built environment, and obviously also a more nature-based environment. Mainly through three things: circular business models, so a more sharing economy using what we already have; product material efficiency, so the efficiency of how we produce things, but then also the recycling, recirculation as part of that production. Today, we would like to focus on the demand side, on the one hand, and on how we can use better tools around circularity in the built environment. Why the demand side? Last week, we issued this report on the business case for circular buildings, where we're trying to show how we can assess the business case and how we can talk to investors, developers, that this brings benefits to all. And in the second part, on a new toolkit, the Circular Building Design Toolkit that Arup have worked on with EMF, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So without further ado, I would like to now hand over, just quickly, I forgot this slide in terms of housekeeping. We are recording, and you can use Slido if you would like to ask questions during the session, and especially in the second half with the panel, we can hopefully also make reference to some of these questions. So just use Slido with this code, and then you can send us some questions. Next slide. Now I'm happy to hand over to you, Emmanuel, and you will present to us the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. Hello to everybody. So I have the honor, the pleasure to present some of the main elements of this report around the business case for circular buildings. Very quickly, But if you are all in the room and hearing our live, I'm sure that you know that globally the world is only 9% circular, that building and construction accounts for a big part of resources consumption, a big part also of CO2 emissions, that in the last years we have seen an acceleration of resource consumption. I have always in mind that figures that China between 2011 and 2013 produced as much concrete than the US for the whole 20th century. So we are in an acceleration mode that obviously in a context where we will have more than 2 billion people additional living in the cities in the next 30 years, it cannot last like this. We are really going into the wall if we are not able to decouple the construction and its resource intensity. So next slide. But it happens in addition that there are a strong value to circular economy, and that actually the concentration of those opportunities are mostly in 8 materials, which are listed here. And as you can see, a number of them which are part of the built environment. So again, there, and the other part, mostly it's nature, agriculture, forestry. So we can see there again the importance of building and construction in terms of circular economy, and that the built environment can address circular economy in all its aspects. I will not enter into the theory of circular economy, but there are options to work on product life extension, on sharing platform, on resource recovery, on product as a service, on circular supplies. You know all this. Next slide. This has been, there have been a first piece of work that has been done at the level of WCSD in 2018, scaling the circular built environment, highlighting making this assessment, as I mentioned, and identifying the main barriers. Main barriers related to culture. Now, please come back. Yeah. Related to culture, related to regulations, related to market, technology, and education. And from that baseline report, the idea was to dig into some of those barriers. So next slide. And this is the purpose of this second report that has been released very recently, addressing 2 of these main barriers, the value barrier and education. This working on a literature review and a number of interviews and a number of project case studies, and I think that we will come more in detail to these case studies afterwards, to identify what are the main benefits of circular economy in the built environment and how to increase the stakeholder engagement. So next slide. This work has been done in a group conveyed by WCSD, but in strong partnership with the World Green Building Council and the Global Alliance for Building and Construction, with a number of partners, and a number of those partners are in the room today. So the core of this work is this value case around a number of case studies, really trying to understand economic value cases. It's on, I mean, cost saving as first, replacing virgin raw materials by recycled material or reused material, increase price of product and services because you increase the value of usage, new business opportunities, especially when we look at tertiary buildings, value retention, the values that can be increased by the higher usage of circular economy. But not only the economic value case has been looked at, but more globally, integrating social benefits and environmental values. Next slide. So, I mean, I let you read what are the conclusions and recommendation. The main one being to widespread whole life carbon assessment and whole life cycle costing in order to increase the level of awareness through better data and better data sharing, in particular related to circular solutions. There will be, and that's the last slide, there will be some follow-up work to continue to dig into the data and the way to measure the benefits in terms of circularity. This idea to create a circular construction forum to share learning on businesses, on cases, and how to overcome barriers. And also this work, which is already existing in some places related to material passports of the buildings. We felt the need to map all existing initiatives across the world to understand how to get to a next level in terms of material passports in order to enhance circularity in those buildings. So that's it. You can obviously get more information through the team of WCSD. And now I give the floor to Arapi.
I'll do the transition. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. I would really like to thank Saint-Gobain and Stora Enso in particular as the co-leads of this project. You have made sure that we stay on track because it's not been a simple undertaking. And I would actually like now to come to Austin Bates, who is joining us online, who has been together with Phil Kelly, the lead author on the side of Ramboll. So Austin, I just wanted to ask you one question, the challenges you have been facing in actually gathering all the evidence, but also the lessons you have learned and what do you see needs to happen next? So thank you, Austin. We don't hear you yet.
How's that, Roland?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Austin Bates from Ramboll. So in terms of the challenges we faced during the report development, well, I should say in terms of the global survey that informed the project findings, there's clearly an overwhelming appetite across the value chain in terms of embracing circular economy approaches. That's from the investor right through to the occupiers of buildings, but there are clearly challenges which is stopping wider uptake of this. And one of the key barriers or challenges in developing the business case was the lack of financial data. So when we asked stakeholders across the globe about this, over a third of respondents did not know whether financial savings were made through the implementation of their work through circularity. And that's a big number. There's intuition, but many stakeholders couldn't actually quantify what that is effectively. So that's a key challenge. Another obvious challenge that we were seeing time and time again is the existing market, particularly around the price points of virgin materials. So the cost of virgin materials is often still much lower, in many cases, not all, than perhaps circular options, recycled options, reused products. Obtaining consistent quantitative data to support the business case was another challenge, in terms of when speaking to stakeholders in this space, often circular approaches that were adopted for buildings, such as providing more adaptable, flexible buildings that really eke out efficiencies in the utilization of the building. Well, the quantification of that was less clear. And finally, in challenges, really is defining a shared goal. So a shared goal around circularity that translates to different stakeholder viewpoints. That was a really important consideration that was followed through the report. So, for example, if you're an investor, then one's focus may be around maximizing an existing asset value using circularity. Whereas if you're a building contractor, then the business case will look different and be more focused perhaps on design and construction approaches in terms of the business case. So and the second point there, Roland, around lessons learned. So there's was mentioned a few times, clearly a need for better consistent data, I should say, and addressing these gaps is really going to be key. So maybe as opposed to doing things differently, what was coming through actually, it's about adapting established tools to better capture the data to establish the business case. So for example, we really need to improve our knowledge and embed data on the materials that are used within a building into a digital logbook or a materials passports to enable information, particularly around its recovery and reuse alongside other material characteristics as well. Then of course, one can use established tools such as life cycle costing to better capture and report that residual value. We have found actually lessons learned, actually the reuse of materials really has the ability to create a strong local identity for occupiers. And we had examples on case studies that showed really strong market performance for developments that had used reused materials that really connected with that local community and neighborhood. And there is a demonstrable least price advantage we've seen as well from some case studies within the report. And these relate specifically to reductions in energy costs and service charges through circular design, creating effectively more maintainable buildings that then translates into improved earnings for those building occupiers and building owners, I should say. And finally, kind of lessons learned is there is a learning curve in delivery of circular buildings. That came through very strong. There will be and are requirements for new roles in this space in the industry, whether that's around selective demolition or certification of reused products. But however, this learning curve can then in turn provide a competitive advantage for future development projects down the line. So that's kind of insights from lessons learned. Does that pick off your questions, Roland? Was there another one I've missed? Or
no, that's perfect. Thank you very much,
Is that
Austin.
okay?
It was really just to get your perspective on, the work that you have conducted. And I would just like to remind us that, especially in all our discussions here at the COP, we're still in a relatively new debate. We're introducing this idea that the built environment is responsible for 40% of global emissions, because we have tended to say energy and industry in different corners, but we are looking here at a demand side system. And so I think we're coming with this message of measuring all these emissions, whole life carbon. And I think then we will start talking about circularity as a key way to also unlock that. So I would just like us to keep in mind that we are maybe here at the advanced edge of doing work, and especially this work, I think, and maybe not a surprise that there were challenges for you to find some of this evidence, but I do think it's really the way forward and up to us to really bring this into the wider discussion. So I'd like to thank you, Austin and Emmanuel, and we will come back to this in the panel discussion just afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to now hand over to Richard Boyd with Arup, who will talk to us about the Circular Building Design Toolkit. And I got the title right.
Thank you, Roland. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard. I'm working with Arup in Berlin. And today I'd like to talk to you for about 7 minutes maybe about the Circular Building Design Toolkit. This is something we've been working on with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, part of the strategic partnership between Arup and EMF. And we've brought it together because as we were looking at applying circular economy into the built environment, one of the key challenges we found was that, designers, investors, built construction clients and asset owners, they didn't have a single place and a single process where they could sort of embed and pool circular principles into the asset lifecycle. And Austin just mentioned there are plenty of existing tools, but where can you find a place where they're all in one place? There's a process, there's a guidance, there's context that helps a new designer follow that process. So we'd identified this. So then we've put the toolkit together in order to sort of address this need. That's why the aim of the toolkit, therefore, is to make sure that more of our projects, faster and with more ambition, start to embed those circular economy principles into their projects so that we are eliminating pollution, circulating materials, and regenerating natural systems this decade, not not next decade. So if we go to the next slide, please. What is in the toolkit? What is on the platform? Well, first of all, there's a set of workshop materials that allow new design teams to sort of start to explore the topic in their own project context. There's then a series of actions and workflows that design teams can work through, and that helps them sort of turn those initial ideas in the workshop into implementable actions on projects driving real change. There's also a library, a directory of solutions and references, existing case studies that demonstrate and inspire teams with international best practices of what are the things that they can do that are already mature in the marketplace. The fourth point, I mean, this really touched on the previous presentation from Austin and Emmanuel, this, design tools for circular design assessment. There are lots out there, life cycle assessment, whole life costing among them. We have brought as many of the tools that we know of, the guidelines, the methodologies, the processes together in one place here, including life cycle assessment tools, so that within a framework, within a guideline, designers know when to use them and which tools are work best. Those first four things we've worked on, the things that we really want to get to, our vision for the full toolkit, is to then also take that one step further and bring in the design ratings, bring in the benchmarking that enables that data challenge that was just mentioned to be really addressed, and allow teams to know whether they are best practice, good practice, or need to work a little bit harder. So if we go to the next slide, please. The toolkit has really been built around users, so it's going to be accessible online. It is going to be free to use, and it has three pathways through it that users can go on. The first is the learn one. So if you haven't used circular economy before, we just mentioned again awareness. People will be coming to it for the first time. There's a pathway that takes you through the initial principles, the what circular economy is, the why of circular economy, and really introduces the topic. Once you've been through that process and you come back to the tool the next time, there's an engage pathway, which uses the workshop materials and other processes to really sort of get the project context and the project team engaged with circularity. And then there's the act. Once you've sort of really engaged with it in your own project context, what are you going to do about it and how are you going to drive real change? If you go to the next slide, please. We've also organized the concept of toolkit around 4 principles. These principles relate to the PAS 2080 carbon management standard from the UK in 2016. Again, building on what already exists, but we're talking about building nothing as your first response, then building for long-term value, then building efficiently, and then building with sort of appropriate or the right materials. If we go to the next slide. And those 4 principles organize then 10 strategies. So what are the sort of big overarching strategic moves in my design that I can take to really get circularity in there? And that starts, the first 2 are refusing new construction and increasing building utilization, which we heard mentioned before. The next 3 are sort of designing for longevity, designing for adaptability, designing for disassembly. Then we're looking at refusing unnecessary components, stripping things back, increasing material efficiency and reducing the amount of virgin material where possible. And finally, looking at reducing the use of carbon intensive materials, making specific that connection to emissions, and also designing out hazardous and polluting materials, because of course, essential fundamental circular economy is do not circulate things that are harmful. So the real challenge is, maybe back one slide. The real challenge is, yes, please, thank you. The real challenge is like, in different projects, these strategies do not pull in the same direction all the time. So it is going to take really skillful design, really thoughtful design, and using the toolkit framework for designers to choose which strategies are most appropriate for their projects. Next slide, please. And to respond to that, to help designers, we've produced a card for each strategy that takes them through what are the indicators, the KPIs as to whether you're succeeding with that strategy. What are the benefits and the challenges of adopting that strategy? What kind of impact level relative to the others can that strategy achieve? And where in the design process are you going to make most impact by adopting that strategy? And which design teams, which design members are best placed to implement them? Next slide, please. But strategies are, sometimes it's all a bit blah, blah, blah. So what we want to get to is real specific action. So we get under the strategies, we have action cards, and the action cards tell designers specifically what are you going to change in your building that is going to really get circular economy going. And if we go to the next slide, these actions also have detail underneath them. What is the action? Which bit of the building is it applying to, using the brand layers of space, plan, structure, skin, and so on? Which stakeholders in your design process do you need to engage to make sure that that action can be achieved? And when in the design phase do you really need to act to make sure that you can deliver it? And then some examples to sort of bring it to life. Go to the next slide. please. I mentioned indicators. Of course, the EU is one of the real drivers forward in this area, and the levels framework already gives us a set of indicators for sustainable building. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We are aligned with that. And we're also very pleased to say that the World Green Building Council has endorsed the toolkit because it aligns with their strategic objectives around getting more sustainable, more circular buildings happening globally. Go to the next slide, please. I mentioned, that design process was really about getting action going on real projects. Again, we are looking at global best practice. So presenting examples that design teams can take inspiration from to understand that, some of this stuff has already been done. They do not have to start everything from scratch. Go to the next slide. I mentioned tools, pulling together into one place, all the tools so that teams do not have to reinvent the wheel. You can just dive in there and pick out the things that work for your project. Next slide, please. And those workshop materials will also be downloadable and usable both in online formats and downloadable PDF formats for design teams to sort of think through the framework, think through the strategies, think through actions, and pick out the things that are really going to make most impact and most influence on their projects. Next slide, please. And to finish it all off, at the end of the process, we're putting in place a generator of circular design statements. So you'll be able to, if you've used the platform, if you've used the toolkit, you'll be able to identify the strategies and actions that you've taken, put them into the generator, and it will produce for you a sort of a standard statement explaining to your stakeholders, explaining to your investors, explaining to whoever asks how you've implemented circular economy principles on your project. So we're launching or announcing the toolkit today. We are going to be, the toolkit we're putting the finishing touches on it, and it's going to be sort of available for people to use in early 2022. So watch this space. If you'd like to find out more, reach out to me, reach out to a colleague, or reach out to WBCSD if you'd like to find out more. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Richard, Thank you for this presentation. And as you say, stay tuned for the launch itself early next year. And yeah, I think it's an important work, and happy maybe to work again on the dissemination and making sure this gets into the community and that we can use it. If you allow me, I'll go without further ado into now the discussion part. So thank you all for sticking to time. We have the second half of this event to discuss with colleagues from the industry. And I'm very pleased to hand over to Emilia Hagberg with Skanska, Senior Sustainability Manager, and you will moderate this discussion for us. Thank you, Emilia.
Thank you, Roland, and thank you for all the presentations. I just would like to start with a few comments from me when I have listened to the rest of you. I mean, it's obvious that we need to go into more of a circular way of planning and using our materials in the construction industry. We know that our industry stands for so much of the world's carbon emissions, and most of that is, or a large part at least, is from materials, and we will never go all the way without a circular approach. But I think that one aspect that makes circularity in the construction and built environment so difficult to grasp is the long-term perspective. What we built at Skanska, it will stand for 50 or 100 years, and the places that we use, there are probably buildings that has been standing there for 50 or 100. So the lifespan is several hundred years sometimes, and that is really difficult for all us to plan compared to IT industry or fashion, where a company can actually have a circle within their own hands. But just from my perspective, there are a few things that we need to push for, and that is the classification of waste. It's very practical, but from a construction perspective, when we deal with materials, when it's called waste, and then it's in many countries it's not even allowed to reduce, because if it's called waste, a lot of other regulations comes and then you can't use it. So there is a very practical policy question, and also the importance of strong requirements in public procurements. Skanska, we have about 50% of our business from public clients, and that is mostly infrastructure, and that push the public sector could do on this with requirements would really push the market. And I couldn't more emphasize what has been told about the transparency throughout the value chain and the data that is so important. But with that, I would like to introduce the panel. And so the panelists are Eva Hinkers, Group Board Sustainability Development Director at Arup, Jeremy Gibbard, Specialist Built Environment Consultants, Gorsh, Usha Ironinga, Lead or Co-Lead UN Sustainability Buildings and Construction Program, and Annie Heachan, Sustainability Engagement and Strategy Lead, ArcelorMittal. And I would like to start to hand over to you, Usha. What's your perspective?
Many thanks. I hope you can hear me okay. Great. Good evening from Melbourne, Australia. This is truly a global and virtual panel. I'm interested in presenting to you some of the work that we did for the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program, particularly looking at circularity in the built environment. So last year, we looked at 7 regional reports across different parts of the world, including Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, Gulf Cooperation Council countries, North America, and Oceania. And we brought all this work together with the global report. And what we identified in the global report were 10 recommendations. The first of this is the need to think and act differently. More so now than ever before, we cannot think about solving circularity problems with linear approaches. So we are looking at truly systemic, recognizing these systemic problems. We need to deal with these systemic problems with solutions that also recognize the importance of these systemic problems. Monitoring and reporting is essential, and we feel that sustainable development goals are one way for us to be able to set up some benchmarks and baselines to be able to benchmark and allow ourselves to understand where we are at and where we want to travel. Speakers before me have already talked about the importance of life cycle. So life cycle consideration for buildings and the built environment right at the outset. And again, some of the work that Arup is doing in the design space is particularly important and something that needs to be taken into consideration in the future. Building materials, again, re-emphasize the importance and the role of building materials. We know that building materials have a huge footprint, and therefore we need to start thinking more about the use of bio-based materials and how these bio-based materials could have a role to play in the future, including things also like building material passports. We also believe that procurement processes are very important. Procurement, particularly in the developing regions of the world where government can set examples or can be exemplars of procurement practices, particularly green procurement practices, is very, very critical. A lot of work has been done to date looking at the importance of mitigation, and this whole discussion at COP in relation to net zero is important. But within that context, we should not forget the role of adaptation and resilience. And we know that buildings once built last for a long period of time. So we need to, at the outset, not just think about mitigation, but also how these buildings will withstand floods or any other type of disasters or hazards that might need to be considered at a local scale. We think that locally adapted solutions are particularly critical in the developing parts of the world, where in some areas, indigenous knowledge, indigenous technology is still being used, and we should not lose these diverse approaches to solving problems in the built environment. We also think that locally adapted solutions with new business models. So again, the role of procurement, the role of Industry 4.0, the role of digitalization, all of this needs to be taken into consideration. Last but not least is the role of collaboration and financing arrangements. Again, there are lots of models where service providers, rather than ownership-based models, are being used within the industry. And most importantly, overhauling education and skills, because this calls for a new way of thinking, new way of acting, new way of designing, new way of managing buildings. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Usha. Just a question very shortly. What sort of training or education do you think will be necessary for this transition with the background that you have from the academic world?
Sure, thanks for that. The way we have looked at education at this point in time has been very siloed. We don't think about cross-disciplinarity. We don't think about moving from a vocational education or scaffolding education from a trade qualification or a vocational qualification into higher education. So while the role of research is important in all of this, there needs to be more flexibility and agility in the way we teach, in the way we package, and in the way we expect critical thinking to continue throughout the life of individuals that are going to become professionals and decision makers of the future.
Thank you very much. Eva, what is your view?
Thank you, Amelia, and thank you to everyone. Good afternoon from Germany. So as we have heard from the previous speakers, from Emmanuel and from Roland, we all understand the impact of building material on greenhouse gas emissions, and Roland has alluded to the fact that circular economy has the potential to reduce up to and more 50% of that emission. So it's really huge what we're talking about. So despite these high-level data, though, the focus to date, as we all know, has been on energy efficiency and not on the embodied carbon in the construction industry. And there's also a lot of literature about the promising benefits of a circular economy around economic, environmental, and social benefits. And yet we don't have any specific quantitative data and metrics that would support the transition of circular economy in the built environment at large. So we are on a mission to change that. And one of the next key steps, we believe, in achieving that is through changing the way we assess carbon in the industry. So we want to move to assessing whole life cycle carbon on projects. So gathering embodied as well as the operational carbon, and that way be able to establish baselines and being able to define what good looks like in the industry. And we believe that will accelerate the sector's transition to net zero, making that more visible. And therefore, we as a firm, Arup, have moved to or committed to adopting whole life carbon assessment as of next year for all buildings, new and retrofit. That we believe is a really key next step in achieving the transition. But all stakeholders have a role to play, and we need to all collaborate and be on this mission together. And that's why I'm really, really pleased that we were able to launch the Circular Economy Toolkit today, because it's accessible online, it's free to everyone, and it will be hopefully a very useful tool for designers, construction clients, asset owners, private and public, and help them to make the right decisions on their project with better outcomes at the end, and lower carbon buildings. So hopefully the toolkit will be an enabler, and the more it's being used, the more valuable it will become over time. And there's really a lot to gain from this, isn't there? So the transition towards circular economy, the eliminate, circulate, regenerate, it offers many things. So it offers a path to net zero, it addresses climate change, it mitigates biodiversity loss. And if we can overcome the blockers, there's this promise of a multi-billion-dollar business case that we can unlock. Thanks, Emilia.
Thank you very much. I think that was a good a good advertising for the toolkit, for support for that. So good luck. By that, I hand over to Annie. She's with me in the room.
Thank you. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of a steelmaker. ArcelorMittal is one of the world's largest steelmakers. So thinking particularly about the materials used in a building, I think the three core elements of a circular building have got to be around the selection of the material. How are they selected? On what basis? What are the criteria? On the way the material is used. How is the building designed to minimize the use of the material to really get those material efficiency gains that Roland mentioned at the beginning? And thirdly, what happens to those materials at the end of the building's life? So three very simple aspects that we all know, I think we're familiar with. I mean, the good news when we think about it from a steel perspective is that, you know, on circularity, steel already has excellent credentials. Up to 100% of steel in a building is recovered at the end of life. Steel is endlessly recyclable, and steel that's used in a building does not suffer from that use. It can be reused with the same strength over and over again, right? So, you know, if you were a university PhD student inventing a new material for the circular economy, I think, you know, you would come across the fact that we already have one. It's steel. The question is, how do you maximize the reuse, the recyclability of steel in the building to ensure that we can really get these emissions down? And I think there are a number of barriers. The first is that we don't have enough scrap in the world to actually produce all the steel we need from recycled material. So we have to decarbonize the primary side as well. Now, most of all of the structural steel you'll see in a building is 100% recycled. So we can lower the carbon emissions from that by using renewable energy. So ArcelorMittal has a product, X-Carb, renewably recycled and renewably produced, which does exactly that. But when it comes to the facades and the facades, internal and external, you're going to need to use primary steel. And so a lot of the other discussions in this event are talking about the policies we need to support that. But let's think also about the end of the building's life and the reuse of the materials. So we've heard a lot about the need for whole life CO2, and I would absolutely support that. If you consider the recyclability of the material, but even the reuse, then we have a real win-win. The problem is, as engineers, architects specifying materials, they need the confidence that those materials can be reused and that they have the same strength to be reused as a primary material would be. So what we're lacking is a system for requalification of those materials. And if we can get that into place, then I think we can train students at university right through to working with engineers and architects to be able to specify the reuse of steel in new buildings.
Thank you. A reflection, when we look at our waste and what we do with our materials, we know that steel is the one that we have the most information about because that is the only thing that we actually get paid for. So that is a business case. Is there something that you can share to the other, from your experience, to the other materials that could be valuable when we take the next step?
I think it comes back to making the economic business case, right? So yeah, 100% of scrap that's recovered is bought back by steelmakers to remake into new steel. Because so if we can create the same value for other materials, then we can improve those cycles as well. And I think it comes down to looking at the embodied carbon of valuing the embodied carbon of the material over its entire life cycle. So if we were valuing the CO2 that's embodied in the material, then we would be, and including the end of life and the recycling, then we would be selecting materials that are reused and are recycled. So we would be incentivizing. So if we have the price on carbon based on a standard that is including whole life CO2, then we'll be selecting the materials and driving and encouraging the recovery of those materials and the technologies to recycle them. So in steel, we don't have the technological issue, but we still do have some of the economic challenges to really make the steel of the environmental advantages of a material a really true aspect of the building's value. Because at the moment, as we know, engineers can complain about the price of steel, but actually at the end of the day, the value of the building is much more than the materials used. We're not valuing the environmental aspects of the materials.
Thank you. Jeremy, you have an experience from Africa, and also where you see the benefits of a circular approach also when it comes to social aspects. Please share with us.
Okay, thank you. It's Jeremy here from Pretoria. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I think the point I wanted to make is that in developing countries, there are many pressing issues. So as well as climate change, we need to look at employment, health and education, informal settlements, environmental degradation, inadequate water systems, sanitation. So one of the big issues is there are many balls that are being juggled in developing countries. And one of the huge benefits of the circular approach is that it not only addresses a lot of the key environmental issues, it also creates beneficial social and economic impacts in terms of new jobs, lots of new small enterprises. If you look at what's happened in the Netherlands, Finland, there's a kind of whole booming economy that's happening around some of the circular economy processes that are starting to develop. And if we look at that approach, we can look at, bio-based materials, we can look at recycling, and carry on constructing much of the infrastructure that's needed. So new schools, new clinics, new housing, and start addressing a lot of the social and economic issues, regenerating environments, addressing climate change, but at the same time creating a lot of new jobs and enterprises. And if you're in a country like South Africa, where we have about 40% unemployment, that's a huge benefit. That's something that will sell the approach to government, to business, to many different areas. And I think if you look at those synergies that you get through the life, the circular economy, they're very strong. So they make the business case strong, and also the impacts. So if we look at the SDGs and if we look at, the climate change targets, it's one of the ways where we have some chance of achieving many of those targets. And I think many of the other silo approaches don't really have the potential to create the scale and level of impact that we actually need to create. Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you. It would be interesting to see if you have any very concrete examples of what you talked about.
Yeah. We did a very interesting job with UNEP in Zambia, looking at prototype houses. So Zambia has a backlog of about 1 million houses that need to be built. And so we experimented with, you know, a range of different new houses. And what particularly we wanted to address was the existing situation where many houses were being built using imported Chinese or South African materials, a lot of vinyls, lots of plastics, not easily repaired, had a very short life cycle. So there's a huge amount of waste associated with, you know, the existing processes. And what we did was we looked at using bio-based materials, so a lot of timber. We looked at earth construction, and making sure that all the components were easily recycled and could be repaired also very easily. So through that process, we got to the point where, you know, more than 95% of the building recycled the capital value locally, and created and supported small enterprises, created a lot of new jobs. And so it was a kind of very beneficial approach for the economy as well as for the environment in Zambia, because you had knock-on timber enterprises, forestry, sustainable forestry enterprises, etc. And just maybe the kind of last point around that is to just look at how that can be supported very easily by governments through local content policies. And that's something that has been done here in South Africa very successfully. And I think it's a very easy way where you specify a minimum local content to encourage the use of, you know, local sustainable products, and you can then also help regenerate the economy and create local jobs and enterprises. So thank you.
Thank you. In the slide, I see a question on specifically on the circular building design toolkit. I think that you can find out that information elsewhere. So I would like to ask another question to Eva. You were talking about mainstreaming the industry. What if you would pick one thing that would really be the push for that would mainstream circularity in the construction? What do you think that would be?
One thing, okay. Guess the most important thing I see is creating level playing fields by introducing policy and legislation. That, you know, can stretch from carbon taxing possibly, but I would like to talk about an example that we see in Europe, which is around regulations around sustainable finance. And a good example there is a taxonomy that the EU has introduced, which is really a very effective tool to channel investment to green and circular products. Because one of the objectives the taxonomy has, there are 6, and one is circular economy. So the taxonomy qualifies what green financial products are, and in order to qualify under those criteria, one is circular economy. So that's a really, really effective tool, and we already see the effect on that in the market, and we see the focus that investors are taking because of that policy and how that is now translating into national legislation. But let me add 2 very quickly. Another one is green procurement, which we heard from Asha earlier. So that is treating carbon as an equal currency on projects. And the third one would be consistent regulations for reused materials, which are not in place in many cases. But I mean, you also talked about blockers and how we can mainstream circular economy. Annie, do you want to add to what I just said?
Yeah, very shortly.
No, I thoroughly support what you've just said, Eva, but I would add one thing, which is if we have a standard to level the playing field, then it's very straightforward for public procurement commitments to really drive the agenda, I think.
That was perfectly short. Thank you for that. And by that, we have run out of time for the panel. Thank you very much. And there was a question about the toolkit that I think that I hand over for Roland. You can probably answer.
All the difficult questions for me. Was there another question? No, it's the one on when it will be accessible, correct? So I understand, Richard, that it will be launched early next year. You want to say a bit more? Because I think there is excitement. People want to see it, so please.
Yeah, it will be available online, free to use from early. We have not set a date, but early 2022 is what we were saying. And I guess I hope that we can sort of, with the circulation, the attendees and the event today in the room and online, we'll maybe sort of notify those who are interested or express an interest to be notified of when that launch date will be.
Would you have a question? We have a couple more minutes, so please go ahead. You just say your name and who you work for.
Hello, my name is Enlai Hui. I'm from Smith Hammerlassen Architects. And since we're the only architects in from Denmark in the COP, I'm also representing Architects Declare Denmark, and we have a talk tomorrow about this topic. So there's prospective and retrospective circularity. And in prospective circularity, I think we have a fairly good handle with material passports. That also covers components as well. But with retrospective circularity, we have two approaches. One of them is adaptive transformation of existing stock, which I think is probably the most important decarbonizer that we have. And the second one is about reusing materials and components that are salvaged. So say, for example, building as material bank processes, or groups like rota.dc. Two issues that we find with that approach when you're looking at the architectural approach to circularity, it's kind of cold face. One of them is that warranties and liability becomes a real issue, because especially on the component level. So no problem with bricks, but when it comes down to more complex components like doors, columns, etc., how do you ratify the lifespan or the performance of something that has already been used? We can test to see whether a component is fit for purpose, but we don't have the mechanisms available to allow us to use that, such that if anything happens, the investor, the developer, is able to reclaim the value of those components that are invested. And that's a massive issue. Second thing is that there's a fear in the industry of grandfathered toxic components in things that are recycled from the material bank. So what we're calling for is a nationalized system of testing and ratification that will allow investment and insurance to be applied to these products in the same way as there are new products. Richard, you've got to.
That is definitely a question that could lead us to discuss the rest of the afternoon, but maybe one or two reactions. Richard.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll respond briefly on both. I think the UK GBC in the UK had a circular economy working group, one working group of which looked at that insurance and liability question. And following conversations with insurers, providers and everything, they concluded it wasn't an issue. It's kind of can be covered in traditional existing PI arrangements for the consultants and the designers. If they are satisfied, the insurers are satisfied. So it comes down to the usual process of professional due diligence, reasonable skill and care, and not putting anything that you would find dangerous. I think on grandfathering toxic materials, yes, it's an issue. I guess we're aware of the main ones around asbestos, lead paints, and those kind of things. I think some measures like indoor air quality monitoring, which is, with IoT and digital transformation becoming more achievable, it can allow us. There's an example of a healthy office fit out that had some red London phone boxes put in it that had been painted with red, and they were brand new, red painted lead paint boxes. The indoor air quality monitoring picked that up and they were removed from the space very quickly. So I think there are, on both fronts, there are sort of mature and existing solutions that help us mitigate those risks.
Thank you for that rapid fire answer. Anyone online, would you like to, we have 1 more minute and then I'll close. Would anyone like to react as well? It's okay. Good. Well, thank you. And one advantage of being here in person is that we can keep discussing. Online, I think you had the advantage, you probably heard better because it was not easy for us here to hear each other because we're speaking into a mic. But in any case, I would like to thank you all for participating. First of all, we have rushed a bit to finalize the report and present it here at the COP, but we will have a bit of longer webinar on the business case for circularity, hopefully before the end of the year, together with Rumble. So we will take the time to properly disseminate this, and obviously also for one of the key audiences, which is the end users, especially developers, investors. So more to come. I think the same with Richard's toolkit. Sorry, I call it Richard's toolkit. More to come. Maybe just to close and make the link back to our 40% and why we are here at the COP. On Thursday, we have the Built Environment Day. Joda Silva is with us. She will moderate a panel on deep collaboration that will bring together ministers, mayors, and regional leaders, as well as CEOs. And I think one of the key messages we have brought here is a lot of what we have just discussed. How do we transform this market, is very fragmented and short-term focused, so that we all align behind net zero and those targets? And the first two things are enablers. It's that common vision and that we all go for the same. We need to halve emissions by 2030 and be net zero by 2050. Halving emissions means we need to reduce embodied carbon by 40 or 50% or more by 2030, which is a lot. And we have to be net zero in operation, at least for new build, by 2030, which basically means designing it today. And that radical collaboration or deep collaboration, that's why we are all here. And we identify 3 levers. And again, they are key also to unlock circularity. Whole life carbon measurement. We have to come at this from measuring all emissions and then look at those reduction strategies. And I think especially Annie's points were also very much to that. That will really help us to then select the right solutions. And the carbon cost. I think many have brought it up. We need to, you do not build something without knowing the cost. So we also need to know the carbon. And ultimately that demand supply relationship needs to change. So it is very much also up to the demand side to ask those questions, or maybe for those here in the room to encourage your demand side to ask you those questions. So with that, I would really like to thank everyone who is here, who has been following online, and more to come this week on Built Environment. Thank you so much and speak to you soon.